welcome back to Midnight Howl, and this is the Ghostly Hour. You guys, welcome back. In tonight's video, we have 3 crazy stories for you, and they're all spooky, scary, and they're all based here in LA. But before the video gets started, make sure you like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. Let me know where you're from so we can go investigate those places and I can bring you more stories. Without further ado, this is the first story. It's called The Calling from Below.
Scott Miller prided himself on his courage. In his career as an investigative journalist, he'd covered government corruption and obscure conspiracy theories. But nothing had unnerved him quite like the letter that appeared on his desk one overcast morning, thick with the scent of damp earth, as if it had come from below. "Beware what lies beneath," it read. "They live among us, guiding our fate from the shadows. Seek the tunnels if you dare, but know this, they won't let you leave." The letter, devoid of a return address, was scrawled in jagged handwriting that seemed to bleed from the page, the letters twisted and distorted like they had been written in haste or fear. As absurd as it seemed, the words burrowed into Scott's mind, leaving a gnawing itch of curiosity he couldn't ignore. Was it a hoax or a setup? Los Angeles had its share of forgotten tunnels and urban myths, but could there really be a hidden society in the catacombs below? The more he pondered, the more it seemed to beckon him. Days passed, and he could feel the call of the tunnels growing louder, like a whispered dare in the back of his mind. Finally, on a damp October evening, Scott found himself at the entrance to an abandoned access tunnel beneath downtown LA. His flashlight flickered as he descended, casting shadows that twisted and danced along the graffitied walls. The silence pressed down on him, thick and suffocating, and with each step, he felt as if he were walking into the city's buried heart, leaving the light and noise of the world above far behind. The air grew colder and damper the further he ventured, and the smell of earth and decay filled his nostrils. The tunnels branched off in countless directions, twisting and narrowing, like the veins of some colossal buried beast. Scott's flashlight cast eerie shapes against the walls, revealing strange symbols that seemed etched by ancient hands, spirals, eyes, and snake-like figures that coiled and stretched along the stone. Just as he reached a bend in the tunnel, he heard a faint scraping sound behind him. He whipped around, his heart hammering, but there was nothing there, only the silent, oppressive darkness. Then he saw it, just a flicker at the edge of his vision, a shadow slinking along the wall, elongated and unnatural. Scott's pulse quickened as he began walking faster, his footsteps echoing in the empty passage. But with each step he took, he could feel the shadows closing in, like invisible hands reaching out to drag him deeper. Panicked, he broke into a run, the labyrinth swallowing him in a seemingly endless spiral of stone and shadow. He tried to retrace his steps, but every tunnel seemed to lead him further into the maze, and soon he realized he was no longer alone. The first voice was faint, a hiss that could have been a trick of his mind or maybe just the wind. But then he heard it again, clearer this time, a deep guttural chant echoing from somewhere far behind him. He glanced over his shoulder, catching another glimpse of that elongated shadow flitting across the walls. It moved with an inhuman grace, twisting and slipping out of sight, as if mocking his attempts to track it. Scott ran harder, his flashlight bouncing wildly. His lungs burned, and every nerve in his body screamed at him to turn back, but each path only seemed to lead him deeper into the winding passages. He could hear them now, their footsteps soft but relentless, a calculated chase echoing through the maze. With every turn, he felt himself slipping further from reality, as if the walls around him pulsed with a life of their own. Memories of old nightmares rose in his mind, dreams of snakes coiled around his chest, scales glinting in the darkness, their tongues flickering as they hissed his name. Faces he'd forgotten seemed to appear in the shadows, taunting him, pulling him forward as he staggered on. An altar stood at the center, carved from ancient stone and adorned with symbols he couldn't comprehend. His pulse thundered as he approached, his body moving as if in a trance. It was then that he realized the truth. The tunnels hadn't led him astray. He had been guided here, drawn toward the center of this dark labyrinth, like a moth to flame. And then he saw them. they emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light. Their bodies were humanoid but covered in scales, their limbs elongated and twisted, their eyes glimmering with a predatory hunger. Scott's breath caught in his throat as he realized he was surrounded by the creatures he'd dismissed as myth, the reptilians. Their presence filled the air with a dark, oppressive weight, and he could feel their gaze burning through him, stripping away his defenses. One of them stepped forward, its face contorting into a grotesque approximation of a human smile. "Welcome, Scott," it hissed, its voice slithering through the silence. "You've come a long way to join us." He tried to back away, but his legs refused to obey. The creature extended a clawed hand, its scales glinting in the greenish light, and pressed 2 fingers to his forehead. A cold shock shot through his skull, flooding his mind with memories that weren't his own. Visions of ancient rituals, empires rising and falling under the reptilians' control, and the faces of powerful leaders he'd seen on TV, each carrying the same cold glint in their eyes. Scott struggled, but it was useless. The creature's thoughts burrowed into his own, filling him with knowledge that felt ancient and alien. He could feel his own memories slipping away, replaced by an overwhelming awareness of his own insignificance, his mind fracturing under the weight of a presence that was far older and more powerful than he could comprehend. Scott's body convulsed as he felt the creature's consciousness pouring into him, consuming his identity piece by piece. His thoughts grew distant, his sense of self fading as a new, cold awareness took hold. He tried to cling to his memories, his past, his purpose, but they were swept away in the flood of alien sensations. Scales, cold blood, a hunger that felt endless. The last of his humanity slipped away as he heard his own voice, twisted and alien, speaking words he hadn't willed. "Yes," it hissed, and he felt a dark thrill at the power in his own voice. "I am ready." Scott was no more. His consciousness had been absorbed, his memories and emotions erased, leaving only the reptilian mind in control. He straightened, feeling the strength of his new form, the sharpness of his new senses. He was a predator now, and his mission was clear: to return to the surface, to blend in, and to further the reptilians' ancient agenda. When Scott, or the creature wearing his skin, emerged from the tunnels that night, the world felt different. Every human he passed looked small and insignificant, each one a pawn in a game they couldn't begin to comprehend. He had a new purpose now: to keep humanity under control, distracted, oblivious to the powers that truly ruled from the shadows. He would return to his life as a journalist, using his influence to shape minds, to keep the population placated and unaware of the darkness lying just beneath their feet. The city of Los Angeles lay sprawling and vibrant under the night sky, blissfully ignorant of the horrors lurking in its depths. And as he walked through the city streets, the creature that was once Scott Miller smirked, knowing that he was now a part of something far greater, a force that would remain unseen, unchallenged, and unstoppable.
Whoa, dude, that was crazy, right? What an unexpected turn. Dude, first Scott Miller was like an investigative journalist, and then, dude, the reptilians came down and like told him to be a part of their organization. I wonder why. I wonder why they get journalists and stuff like that to be a part of the organization. Anyways, guys, little did you know that I'm part reptilian. I'm just kidding. That's the bad part. It's my red skin, you know what I'm saying? It's a little grimy. Anyways, so here goes the next story. The next story is all about a hardcore punk band that is based here in LA. It's not, if there is a real punk band, you guys should go check them out. They're called Local Heads, but it's not them. This is just kind of like something that I did to give them props for what they're doing, because they're doing a lot of good things. But anyways, this next one is about a group of punks who go out in Europe and they get into something crazy. But I'll tell you what it is: a gig in hell.
Dead Reckoning wasn't just any punk band, they were the epitome of LA grit. Formed in the seedy garages of South Central, their music was loud, raw and unapologetic, a perfect reflection of their lives. Mark, the lead singer, was the heart of the band, his raspy voice and wild stage presence earning him a reputation in LA's underground punk scene. Jesse, the bassist, was quieter but kept the band grounded with his precision and skill. Sarah, the drummer, was a powerhouse, her relentless energy driving the rhythm, and Eli, the guitarist, was a shredder with a taste for chaos. Together, they were everything you wanted from a punk band: fast, loud, and never afraid to piss someone off. The punk scene in LA had been good to them, but it was still a hustle. They played mostly in dive bars or DIY shows, often in run-down backyards in neighborhoods like Compton and Watts. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and that was what mattered. They weren't out for fame, they were out for the music, for the release of it. That's why when they got an invite to play a show in the backyard of a fan's place in Watts, they jumped on it without hesitation. The show was exactly what they expected: rowdy, chaotic, and filled with punks from all over the city. The smell of beer and weed lingered in the air, and the makeshift stage was nothing more than a plywood platform set up beside an old beat-up car. The crowd was close, pressing up against the band, thrashing with every beat. By the time their set ended, drenched in sweat and high on adrenaline, they were ready to collapse, but that's when things got strange. As they packed up their gear, a figure approached them from the shadows. The man was tall, with a black hoodie pulled low over his face, but his presence exuded something powerful, an energy that demanded attention. "Good show," the man said, his voice deep and unsettlingly calm. "You guys are the real deal." Mark, ever the charismatic frontman, flashed a grin. "Thanks, man, we try." The stranger stepped closer, close enough that Mark could see the glint of something sharp in his gaze. "I've got an offer for you. There's a gig across the water in Europe, pays well. The crowd there's dying to see something raw like this." Jesse, always the skeptical one, frowned. "Europe? Who are you exactly?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Think of me as a fan. Let's just say I've got connections." Sarah exchanged a glance with Eli, her unease growing. "Why us?" The stranger chuckled, the sound low and chilling. "Because you've got something special, something I think they'd appreciate." He handed them a card, black with a phone number and nothing else. "Call this number. Tell them you're in and you'll have a flight booked." Without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the night, leaving the band standing there in a mix of excitement and apprehension. Mark, always chasing the next adventure, was the first to speak. "Europe, guys, this could be our shot." Eli shrugged, still staring at the card. "Could be legit, or we could get scammed." "Or worse," Sarah added, her voice low. "Something about that guy didn't sit right with me." But the offer hung in the air like an unspoken promise, and by the next morning they had called the number. Within hours, flights were booked, and the band found themselves preparing for the trip of a lifetime, a punk gig in Europe, a chance to take their music across the world. As they boarded the plane, the excitement started to take hold. They were headed to some remote part of Europe, a small off-the-grid town none of them had ever heard of. It didn't matter, to them it was part of the allure, the unknown, the adventure, the chance to play in front of a new crowd. Mark kept hyping it up, talking about how it could be the thing that put them on the map. Sarah wasn't so sure. "Something about this doesn't feel right," she said, tapping her drumsticks nervously on her knee as the plane took off. "I mean, the whole thing, a gig in some random town with no details. It feels shady." "We've done sketchier gigs," Mark replied with a grin, reclining in his seat. "Besides, Europe's always been on our bucket list. Think of it as punk diplomacy." But as the hours passed, even Mark couldn't completely shake the strange feeling settling over them. The man from the backyard show had left a bad taste in all their mouths, but the lure of the opportunity kept pulling them forward. By the time they touched down, the air felt different, colder, more oppressive. The drive to the remote town took them through winding, fog-covered hills that stretched endlessly under a grey sky. The roads narrowed, the trees grew denser, and with every mile, the landscape seemed to grow more isolated, more disconnected from the modern world. Finally, they arrived. The town itself was practically a ghost town, silent, still, and bathed in an eerie twilight. The streets were empty, the houses dark, and the only sign of life was Lucas, the nervous man standing by the side of the road. Lucas had been hired the same day, he explained, as he led them to the venue, a stage in the middle of a cornfield. He lived in the next town over and knew little about this place. "Quiet people," he muttered. "Keep to themselves, I've only been here once before." By the time they returned to the cornfield, dusk was setting in. Lucas assured them the crowd would show, though he didn't look convinced himself. He nervously shifted from foot to foot, glancing at the darkening sky. The band went through their sound check. The cold air made their instruments feel stiff and unfamiliar. The silence around them felt unnatural, thick with anticipation, as if the town itself was holding its breath. "Where the hell is everyone?" Jesse muttered, scanning the empty field as the first stars appeared in the sky. "They'll come," Lucas insisted, though his voice wavered. Mark shrugged. "Guess we'll just have to start the show and see." They kicked off their set, blasting their raw energy into the quiet night. The sound echoed across the field, bouncing off the cornstalks and drifting toward the empty streets. For a while it felt like any other gig, just the band, the music, and the open air. But then Mark saw it, a figure at the edge of the cornfield swaying in the darkness, then another and another. "They're coming," he shouted to the others, a grin spreading across his face. "We've got a crowd!" Excitement surged through them. They played harder, louder, their music pounding through the clearing, drawing the shadowy figures closer. But as the band played on, the figures kept moving, slowly, unnervingly, closer and closer. Their faces were still hidden, their movements stiff and unnatural. It wasn't until the first figure stepped into the light that the music faltered. Jesse's fingers froze on the bass. Sarah's drumming slowed. The person standing before them wasn't alive. Pale, rotting skin stretched over a face twisted in a grotesque expression, its eyes vacant and hollow. Mark's heart raced. What the hell? More figures emerged from the shadows, stumbling toward the stage, their numbers growing with each passing second. It wasn't a crowd, it was an army of the dead. Lucas, standing off to the side, screamed as a decaying hand grabbed his arm. He tried to fight it off, but more hands reached for him, dragging him into the swarm. His terrified shrieks were quickly drowned out by the moans of the undead. "Run!" Mark yelled, swinging his microphone stand like a weapon, smashing it into the skull of the nearest zombie. The band scattered, grabbing whatever they could find to defend themselves. Jesse swung his bass like a club, smashing into the nearest zombie, but they kept coming. Sarah jabbed at them with her drumsticks, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a toothpick. "We have to get to the van," Eli shouted, his guitar slashing through the air, knocking back one of the zombies as it lunged toward him. They fought their way through the chaos, the undead closing in around them. The field seemed endless, each row of corn identical to the last. They could hear the zombies behind them, the snapping of stalks, the heavy shuffling of footsteps. They stumbled into a clearing, gasping for air. Mark searched frantically for anything they could use as a weapon. His heart pounded in his ears, adrenaline surging as he gripped a broken piece of a mic stand, his last line of defense. The zombies emerged from the corn, their dead eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Mark and Eli swung wildly, fighting off the advancing horde, their fear transforming into a desperate fury. But it was a losing battle. The dead kept coming, relentless, their pale hands reaching for flesh, for life. "Go!" Mark screamed, shoving Eli toward an opening in the corn. Eli hesitated, glancing back, but Mark gave him one last push. "I'll hold them off. Run!" Eli nodded, his face twisted with fear and guilt, and then he was gone, disappearing into the corn. Mark turned back to the zombies, gripping the mic stand like a spear as they closed in. He fought until he could no longer swing, his arms heavy, his vision blurring. The last thing he saw was a sea of rotting faces, their mouths open in silent, hungry screams. Eli ran until dawn, his legs trembling, lungs burning, and the screams of his bandmates echoing endlessly in his mind. He had no idea where he was or how far he'd come. He stumbled out of the cornfield into another small town, collapsing on the edge of a dirt road. The early morning light cast an eerie calm over everything, a sharp contrast to the horrors he'd just escaped. He lay there, gasping for breath, his mind numb with terror and exhaustion. Eventually, a local villager found him, a stooped old man who looked down at him with a mix of pity and wariness. Eli tried to explain, but the words came out in broken gasps, barely coherent. "Please, they're all dead," Eli choked out, clutching the man's sleeve. "They're all dead." The man gave him a long, unreadable look before pulling him up gently and leading him to a nearby bench. Eli's mind spun, still trapped in the images of decayed hands and hollow eyes, and the creeping realization that he was the only one who'd survived. The old man shook his head solemnly. "You went to the cornfields, didn't you?" Eli stared, unable to respond. How could he even begin to answer? The man sighed. "Every few years there's an event," he explained quietly, his voice haunted. "A curse, some say. The dead come back, drawn to sound, to life." He glanced toward the cornfields, his eyes distant, as though seeing horrors he'd long tried to forget. There are those who don't heed the warnings, they never come back. Eli shuddered, a cold realization washing over him. This wasn't just a nightmare, this was some cursed, horrible cycle, a dark secret buried in this isolated place. They had been lured here, he was certain of it now, set up like bait for something beyond comprehension. With the old man's help, Eli managed to catch a bus to the nearest city. He felt a strange sense of emptiness as he left the countryside behind, the fog-covered hills swallowing the cursed town in the distance. The rest of the journey passed in a blur. Faces on the bus looked at him with pity, suspicion, even fear, but he couldn't bring himself to explain. What could he even say? That his bandmates had been devoured by the undead in some haunted cornfield. When he finally returned to Los Angeles, it felt like he was walking through a dream, or maybe a memory, some distant life he'd once lived but could no longer relate to. The once familiar city streets seemed foreign, muted. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces, his bandmates. The last moments of terror and desperation on Mark's face, Sarah's screams as she was pulled under, Jesse's outstretched hand disappearing into the swarm of bodies. Days turned to weeks, and life in Los Angeles went on. But for Eli, the horrors of that night clung to him like a shadow. He stopped playing, his guitar gathering dust in the corner of his apartment. Friends and family tried to reach out, but he pulled away, sinking deeper into isolation. One night, unable to bear the silence, he sat down with his guitar, strumming it softly, almost absently. The melody drifted through the empty apartment, filling the space with a haunting, mournful sound. As he played, he felt a presence, a chill that seeped into the room, raising goosebumps on his skin. He stopped, his fingers hovering over the strings. But the sound didn't stop. A faint echo of the melody continued, drifting from the corners of the room like distant voices whispering from beyond. Eli froze, his heart pounding as he listened. The whispering grew louder, almost familiar, like voices he had known but long tried to forget. He could hear them, Mark, Sarah, Jesse, all calling out to him in anguished, hollow tones. He dropped the guitar, stumbling back, his hands shaking. The whispers faded, but the sense of dread remained, thick and suffocating. He tried to convince himself it was a hallucination, the product of exhaustion and trauma. But deep down he knew the truth. The curse hadn't stayed in that European cornfield. It had followed him, an invisible mark etched onto his soul. The dead didn't rest, and neither would he. In the months that followed, Eli became obsessed with the occult, poring over books about curses, hauntings, and ways to communicate with the dead. He grew pale and withdrawn, spending his nights in a haze of half-sleep, listening to the faint, lingering whispers that crept into his apartment whenever he played a note. He began to believe that he owed them something, his bandmates who hadn't made it out. He couldn't ignore the feeling that they were still out there, trapped between worlds, waiting for him. Haunted by guilt and desperation, he decided there was only one thing left to do. One foggy night, he packed his guitar, a few supplies, and boarded a plane back to Europe. He returned to the same countryside, to the same empty road winding through the fog-shrouded hills, all the way to that cursed town. The villagers watched him with wary eyes, some muttering under their breath, but he ignored them. He returned to the field, which looked as empty and unremarkable as ever, save for a few rotting boards that remained from the stage they'd set up months before. He stood there, surrounded by rows of corn that swayed softly in the wind, clutching his guitar. His heart hammered, and his throat tightened with fear, but he was resolved. He took a deep breath, strummed a chord, and began to play. The sound echoed through the night, filling the empty field with music that was both a tribute and a summons. He closed his eyes, pouring every ounce of grief, regret, and longing into the melody, calling out to the friends he'd lost, to the souls who had never found peace. As he played, he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps shuffling through the corn. He didn't stop. His hands moved on autopilot, the music spilling from his fingers as the footsteps grew louder, closer. Then a voice, a familiar voice, broken and hollow. Eli. He opened his eyes, and there they were, his bandmates standing at the edge of the field, their bodies pale and ghostly, eyes filled with sadness and longing. Mark, Sarah, Jesse. They stared at him, their faces twisted in an expression he couldn't decipher. Was it forgiveness, condemnation, or something beyond his understanding? The music faltered, and he felt tears well up in his eyes. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. By morning, there was no sign that anyone had been there, just an empty field, rustling softly in the wind, keeping its dark secrets hidden from the world. And the curse lingered on, waiting patiently for the next song, the next band, the next souls it could claim in its endless hungry cycle.
Oh, you guys are back. Oh man, dude, that was scary, wasn't it? What would you do if you were in Eli's situation and you're the only one who survived and everybody else turned into zombies? Would you be able to take it? I don't know what I would do, man. I don't know what I would do without the KJ. I mean, it feels like I'm alone right now. Am I in that cornfield? Anyways, I'm just kidding, guys. So this next story takes place in Venice Beach. And I know a lot of you guys, and I mean a lot of you guys, have heard of shadow people, right? Well, let me tell you this story about Emily and her encounter with the shadow people on the boardwalk. This one is called The Shadows on the Boardwalk.
The summer of 1979 was the kind of summer that stories were made of. Golden skies melting into the Pacific, the air buzzing with life as skaters, artists and dreamers filled Venice Beach. Emily M. Vasquez, a wiry 19-year-old with fierce determination, was a familiar face among the boardwalk crowd. She carved her name into the scene, not just with her vintage Powell Peralta board, but with tricks that left even the cockiest skaters slack-jawed. That evening, the sunset painted the sky in fiery reds and purples, and the boardwalk had begun to empty. The scent of salt and the faint hum of distant laughter lingered as the lights along the pier flickered to life. Em stayed behind, practicing her slides in a quieter stretch of the boardwalk, where the noise of the crowd was just a memory. She moved to the rhythm of Blondie's Heart of Glass playing in her headphones, the scratch of her wheels on the concrete echoing faintly. She was so focused on nailing the perfect tail slide that she didn't notice the shifting stillness around her. The first sign came like an itch beneath her skin, a creeping unease that prickled the back of her neck. She pulled off her headphones and let her board clatter to the ground as she glanced around. The boardwalk was empty, but something about the shadows seemed wrong. They stretched too long, pooling unnaturally under the dim glow of the streetlights. "Relax, Em," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. "You're just tired." But the air felt heavier now, pressing down on her chest. She picked up her board and pushed off, heading toward the main strip where the lights burned brighter and the sounds of Venice nightlife buzzed like a comforting hum. Yet, the further she went, the darker it seemed to get. The streetlights above her shone just as they always did, but their glow seemed to be swallowed up, leaving the path ahead in shadow. Her heart began to pound. A sound, a faint wet whisper, caught her ear. She stopped abruptly, her chest tightening. Slowly, she turned to look behind her. They were there. At first, they seemed like normal shadows cast by the flickering lights, but as Em stared, they began to shift and ripple. Figures took form, tall, angular, and impossibly dark. They were silhouettes, blacker than the night, with jagged, flickering edges like static on an old television. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The figures didn't answer. They didn't move like people, they glided, their forms stretching unnaturally as they closed the distance between them. Em stumbled back, clutching her board as if it could protect her. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice cracking. One of the figures extended an arm, its shape blurring and dripping as though it was made of liquid shadow. The darkness seemed to pulse, and Em could feel it in her chest, a deep, suffocating cold that made her stomach churn. Her fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. She jumped on her board and pushed off with everything she had, her wheels screaming against the pavement. The shadows didn't stop. They slid across the ground like oil, chasing her with a hunger that was almost palpable. Em swerved onto the main strip, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear them now, not just the rustle of their movement, but voices. Soft, guttural whispers that rose and fell in a language she didn't understand. When she reached the pier, the world seemed to snap back into place. The streetlights were warm and bright, the crash of the waves audible again, and the sounds of laughter and music filled the air. She skidded to a halt, panting and trembling, and turned back. The shadows were gone. "Hey, you okay?" A voice cut through her panic. An older skater stood nearby, eyeing her with concern. Yeah," Em managed. though her voice shook. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. That night, she sat in her tiny studio apartment with every light on. She didn't sleep, her mind replaying the events over and over. Over the next week, she tried to convince herself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the light, but every time she skated alone, the feeling returned, that oppressive weight, the sense of being watched. And in the corner of her vision, she would catch glimpses of those impossible shadows. One night, she woke to find her room cloaked in darkness, despite the lamp she'd left on. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and breathe, and the whispers came again, soft, insidious, crawling into her ears like poison. That was the last straw. Em packed her things and left Venice Beach without a word. She didn't say goodbye to her friends or even leave a note. She just disappeared, hoping to outrun whatever was haunting her. Years later, curiosity got the better of her. She returned to Venice Beach older, wiser, and armed with the hope that it had all been in her head. The boardwalk was still there, though it had changed with time. She wandered the pier, letting nostalgia wash over her. But as the sun set, the shadows deepened. And in the growing darkness, she saw them again, waiting, flickering at the edges of the light. This time she didn't wait to see what they wanted. She left Venice Beach for good, knowing one thing for certain: the shadows never stopped watching, and they never stopped hungering.
You guys, that's crazy, right? What would you do if you were Emily in her situation? Would you have left as well, or leave as well? Left it and leave this? I don't know, man. I don't know English. You know what I'm saying? I flunked out of high school, so I don't know. Anyways, guys, thank you guys for watching. That was all the videos that we have for tonight. Like I said, make sure you like, subscribe, and keep a comment down below. If you got in this far in the video, all the way up until the end, I just want to give you a big thank you and leave an MVP so I know that you watched all the way till the end. Once again, leave that MVP, and I want to just give you a big thank you. Have a good night.